Well, welcome back to Acceptable Worship. Grab your Bible and turn it to Genesis chapter 22. In Genesis chapter 22, we read the famous and somewhat troubling story of where God asks Abraham to offer his son Isaac as a burnt offering on an altar. The artwork of this show actually is depicting this story. Now, the story of Abraham is a story about how nothing can prevent God from being faithful to his promises. God had made a promise to Abraham in Genesis 15 that he would turn Abraham into a great nation by his own offspring. The problem was that Abraham was 100 and his wife was 90, and they had no children. But God tells them in Genesis 18:14, "Is there anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time next year, Sarah shall have a son." And God makes good on his promise. And Sarah and Abraham have a son, and they call him Isaac, the son of the promise. And it is through Isaac that God has promised to make Abraham into nations. And it's through Isaac that Abraham's offspring, God says, will be countless, as many as the stars in the sky. Isaac is essential. He is key to God fulfilling his promise that he made to Abraham. So in Genesis 22, it's bizarre then that God tells Abraham to go to the land of the mountain Moriah and to offer Isaac as a burnt offering there. But Abraham obeys, and in the morning, Abraham gets up, he takes Isaac, he brings some wood, he brings some servants, and they go to the mountain. And they arrive at the location, and Abraham and Isaac go up alone onto the mountain. In Genesis 22, verse 7 and on, it reads this. "And Isaac said to his father Abraham, 'My father,' and he said, 'Here I am, my son.' And he said, 'Behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?' Abraham said, 'God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son.' So they went, both of them, together. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven and said, 'Abraham, Abraham!' And he said, 'Here I am.' He said, 'Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for I know now that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me.' Abraham looks up and then he sees this ram caught in a thicket. And so Abraham offers the ram instead as a sacrifice. So what's going on here? Like I said at the beginning, this is very controversial because God here asks Abraham to offer his son as a sacrifice on an altar. And if we read the rest of the Bible, we know that child sacrifice was seen as abhorrent to God. And God destroyed nations who practiced this kind of stuff. In Leviticus 20, God tells Israel that any person who offers their child in sacrifice shall be put to death. They have profaned God's name. So clearly, God asking Abraham to offer Isaac as a sacrifice here is a test. In fact, in verse 1, it says that the Lord tested Abraham. So clearly, God does not approve of this kind of worship. God has no desire for Abraham to actually offer Isaac. So why was God testing Abraham then? Well, we always want the New Testament to help us interpret the Old Testament, and so the book of Hebrews is helpful here to point out the key lesson. Hebrews 11, 17 to 19 says this, "By faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, 'Through Isaac your offspring shall be named.' He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back." Hebrews says this wasn't just a test to see whether or not Abraham believed that God could fulfill his promise. This was a test to see if Abraham believed that God could literally do the impossible, raising Isaac from the dead in order to keep his promise. As Abraham walked up the mountain, Abraham thought, God promised that through Isaac my offspring shall be named. So even if I kill Isaac, God will raise him up from the dead because God's not going to break his promise. So what does this passage teach us about worship then? Well, here's the lesson. A life of sacrifice requires a heart of assurance. A life of sacrifice requires a heart of assurance. True worship, true sacrifice can only happen when we have absolute confidence in God's faithfulness to his promises. Romans 12 tells us that our entire lives are intended to be lived as a sacrifice. Everything we have, our money, our jobs, our homes, our families, our ambitions, everything is to be laid at the altar before God and offered to him for him to do with as he pleases. So in the same way that Abraham had confidence in God's promise, so much confidence, in fact, that he was willing to offer his son because he believed that God would just raise him from the dead because it was through him that Abraham's seed would come. We will have confidence. We can have confidence that what God commands us to do, what God commands us to offer as a sacrifice to him, he will provide for us. What God asks you to sacrifice for him, he promises to provide. 2 Corinthians 1, in that God promises that if we endure suffering patiently, he will comfort us. So we can endure hardship. We can sacrifice and endure trials and hardship because God has promised that he will comfort us. Later in 2 Corinthians 8, God promises that when we give generously to the cause of the church, God will provide for our needs. Because of this, we can be generous. We can sacrifice. We can go above and beyond because God promises to take care of us when we do that. We don't need to be cheap. We don't need to hold tightly to our finances because God will take care of us when we're obedient. Do you see? True sacrifice is only possible when we have assurance, full confident assurance of God's promises to us. When we know beyond a shadow of a doubt that God will hold up his end of the bargain, we can, as Hebrews 10:23 says, hold fast to the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. That is the kind of worship God is looking for. That's the kind of sacrifice the Lord desires. That is acceptable worship. We'll see you next time.